My proposed fiscal year's 14-15 biennial budget provides what Minnesotans want and deserve from their government: honest accounting, responsible management, and wise investments for a better state now and in the future. It ends the fiscal games, accounting gimmicks, payment delays, and other financial manipulations of the last 10 years. It eliminates the $1.1 billion deficit, then balances the rest of state government spending and revenues during the next 2 years. Let's start with the spending cuts. This budget extends some program cuts made in 2011 and saves money through tougher contracting with HMOs and streamlining and modernizing state government's administrative functions, as we've done with information technology services. As a result, my proposed budget spends almost $1.8 billion less in the next biennium than was forecasted when the previous administration departed. In addition, I'm proposing new investments in education and jobs, which I believe are essential to creating a better Minnesota for our citizens. We know that education is absolutely crucial to better job opportunities, higher incomes, and more fulfilling lives for Minnesotans today and for their children and grandchildren in the future. Yet we have consistently cut state funding for higher education and K-12 education over the last 10 years. We need to put our money where our beliefs are and where we know we can get results. My budget proposes to increase higher education funding by $240 million in the next biennium. These investments will prevent tuition increases, support research and innovation, and align higher education coursework and classrooms with the jobs of the future. It also includes a 25% increase in state student aid to help middle-class families afford higher education. Like higher education, funding in real dollars for K-12 education has declined in the last decade. My proposals will increase state support for K-12 education by $300 million in the next biennium. I made a commitment to increase state support every year I'm governor. No excuses, no exceptions. My 14-15 budget keeps that promise. This budget would increase the basic formula, invest in optional all-day kindergarten for all Minnesota's children, and increase state support for special education. Some people say we cannot afford to make these additional investments to improve our public education. I say that we cannot afford not to make them. A well-educated, productive workforce has been and continues to be our key advantage in attracting new and expanding businesses. If we shortchange our kids' education, we shortchange their futures and ours. There's also growing consensus about the critical need for more and better early childhood education opportunities, especially for potentially at-risk children. In this budget, I am proposing an additional $92 million in support for early learning, including early learning scholarships and other help for families to afford high-quality child care. Better education is closely linked to better jobs, but we must do more. The competition for states for business startups and expansions is even more intense today than when I served as Commissioner of Economic Development 30 years ago. My budget proposes a total of $100 million to expand job creation, including support for the Minnesota Investment Fund, as well as a revised Job Z program to be called the Minnesota Job Creation Fund. If those investments are made, they will yield multiple returns in new jobs, private investments, vibrant communities, and additional state and local tax revenues. And they will help keep our economy moving forward. Those new commitments for more jobs, better educations, and healthier citizens and communities total $732 million for the 14-15 biennium. They represent my best judgment about what Minnesota needs to grow our economy, expand our middle class, improve our quality of life, and take care of those most in need. Some will say we spend too much in this budget, and some will say we don't spend enough. To those who claim this spending is too high, I challenge you to say exactly where more cuts should be made. And to those who say we need to spend more, I challenge you to say exactly where that money should come from. The other big question before us is how to pay for these investments. Erase a $1.1 billion deficit without borrowing, shifts, and other gimmicks. And make our tax system fairer, especially for hardworking middle-income Minnesota families. I expect that significant tax reform will be very difficult to achieve in this legislative session. My proposal starts with two strikes against it. First, it will face powerful opposition from many of those individuals and businesses who benefit under the existing system. Second, it carries the added burden of making up a $1 billion deficit. However, tax reform has strong support from an ever-increasing number of Minnesotans who believe the current system is unfair to them. Most of them are right. The last tax incidence study by the Minnesota Department of Revenue found that middle-income families paid about 12.3% of their incomes in all state and local taxes in Minnesota, while the wealthiest 2% paid 9.7%. Thus, middle-income Minnesota taxpayers paid 1/4 more of their incomes in state and local taxes than did our very wealthiest citizens. That's not fair. In my budget, I'm asking Minnesota's highest earners to pay more of their fair share by adding a new fourth-tier income tax bracket of an additional 2% on the wealthiest 2%. This new fourth tier would apply only to married couples earning more than $250,000 in taxable income, and to single people who earn more than $150,000 a year in taxable income. The income taxes of the other 98% of Minnesotans would remain unchanged. Let me repeat that. My proposal does not raise income taxes on 98% of Minnesota citizens. My sales tax reform would broaden its base, long recommended to improve both revenue stability and fairness. The sales tax would be applied to purchases of many goods and services which are now exempt. However, food, prescription medicine, and clothing items costing less than $100 would continue to be exempt, as would medical and burial services. This base expansion would be accompanied by a reduction in state sales tax to 5.5% for all taxable purchases. That would be a rate reduction of 20%, the largest in Minnesota's history, and it would drop us from the 7th highest to 27th among the states. According to the Department of Revenue's analysis, the total amount of sales taxes paid by typical consumers in Minnesota would remain about the same, with this combination of broadening its base and lowering its rate. The property tax is the most unfair of all state and local taxes, for it must be paid regardless of homeowners' incomes or whether businesses and farms are profitable. Yet Minnesota's overall reliance on property taxes has increased by a staggering 86% in the past decade. This growing property tax burden is irresponsible and it must be reversed. I propose that every homeowner, including farmers, would receive from the state of Minnesota a rebate for the first $500 of property taxes paid in 2013 and every year going forward. My budget also fully funds the renter's property tax credit. The result of these changes in the income tax, sales tax, and property tax would be to reduce the total state and local taxes paid by most Minnesotans. Married couples with taxable incomes below $250,000 would pay the same in income taxes, also pay about the same in sales taxes, and receive a property tax rebate from the state of up to $500. That is a $500 per year tax cut for most middle-income Minnesota families. Individual taxpayers with taxable incomes below $150,000 would also receive annual tax cuts of up to $500. 98% of Minnesotans would not pay higher taxes under my plan, and many would pay less, thanks to the $500 property tax rebate. Under my proposal, Minnesota businesses would receive both temporary and permanent property tax relief, as well as a reduction in the state corporate income tax rate from 9.8% to 8.4%. That's a 14% reduction, and Minnesota's corporate tax rate would drop from 4th highest among the states to 12th. Businesses would join consumers in paying the new lower sales tax rate on a broader base of tax goods and services. Some business executives maintain that business purchases of services from other businesses should be exempt. However, if a Minnesota company today buys taxable goods, such as new carpeting or computers, it pays the same sales tax rate as does a middle-income family. Why then should a business not also pay sales taxes as families would on purchases of services like legal and accounting? Basic fairness says they should be treated the same, and under my proposal, they are. When I became governor 2 years ago, Minnesota state government faced a projected deficit of over $6 billion for the next biennium. During much of the previous decade, governors and legislatures spent more than they raised and filled the gaps with shifts, borrowing, and other one-time gimmicks, rather than facing and fixing their problems. In my first biennial budget, I proposed a balanced approach of spending cuts, new revenues, and more efficient government, which would have eliminated the projected deficits for both the current and the upcoming bienniums. The final compromise, as you know, included a mixture of cuts, shifts, borrowing, and other one-time measures. The results included a lowering of the state's credit rating and a remaining $1.1 billion for the next biennium. The budget I am proposing today will end those games and gimmicks and replace them with honest accounting and responsible financial management. It invests in jobs and education that will expand the middle class and strengthen our economy. It leads the way toward a better Minnesota.
Put a finer point on the goods and services that the sales tax would be expanded to? You mentioned legal and accounting, but what are some other ones?
So in addition to expanding the definition of goods, digital goods and other goods, and consumer services, the business-to-business services would include accounting, legal, business services, consulting services. It would be applied to most services that are provided in this state.
If you take the Department of Revenue's most recent tax expenditure report and look at the section that relates to, again, the exemption of consumer purchases of services and then business purchases of services, most of those would be taxed, but at this lower rate.
Governor, does this not include things like auto repair services, haircuts? Would those all be included?
It does include those services, yes.
So a lot of those consumer services that the people, what are some other examples of that?
Hairdressers,
Yeah, barbers, obviously.
skating lessons. But again, you broaden the base and you lower the rate, and as Commissioner said, the Department of Revenue's analysis is that for most families in Minnesota, that's a wash. Pay a lower rate on more items, comes out the same amount of total sales taxes paid by most Minnesota families, and in total sales collections. So it's not a sales tax increase, it's a broadening of the base, which has been recommended for years by various experts to both improve our stability during economic shifts and also to just fair. I mean, as the Commissioner said, when this sales tax was instituted, about 1/3 of purchases were services, and now they're over 2/3. So our economy has moved to increasingly into a service sector economy, and we leave that out entirely from our sales tax collections.
Could you share with us your rationale for the $100 threshold on applying the sales tax? What was why that level?
There's some of these I'm more thrilled about than others, and taxing clothing kind of goes against my upbringing. But more importantly, it's an area where you have a hard time separating out those who are buying the necessities of life, such as winter coats, and people who are buying what are, essentially fine purchases, but at levels of expenditure that are not no longer necessities. So we tried. It's an arbitrary number. If somebody had a better way to approach it, a more refined way, I hope we could move to that over time. But at this point, it's the best we could come up with in terms of allowing people to buy items that are necessities and lower costs, and paying sales tax on those that are higher costs. And I'm sure it'll give rise to many, many $99.99 specials around the state in the years to come.
Retailers, including the Mall of America, say this will have a devastating impact on their businesses. Extending the sales tax makes us not special anymore.
Well, I think the Mall of America is very special for what it is. And you're going to hear this refrain from everybody. I've heard it already. Everybody who's not paying taxes or is not paying their fair share of taxes and is being asked to start paying taxes or pay more taxes, it's devastating, it's ruinous. Everybody's going to leave the state. I mean, I've heard this for 30 years. And we got to tax somebody, so we're going to tax just the few, the middle-income taxpayer and families who, with the property tax burden goes higher and higher, bear more and more of their unfair share, or are we going to ask everybody, businesses and high-income earners as well as everyone else, to pay a fair share? And if the vested interests that are benefiting from these current inequities are successful, there won't be any change. But then middle-income taxpayers are going to continue to bear an unfair share of the tax burden in Minnesota. And as Commissioner Franz, who I credit with going all over the state to talk and listen to people about the tax policy, more and more Minnesotans think it's just a terribly unfair system, and more of them are right.
Governor, a couple of years ago there was some tax reform changes that were very radical, including things like taking out home mortgages, deductions for home mortgages and things such as that. Were those things on the table and ultimately tossed out? What were some of the things that didn't make the cut here?
Well, we conform with the federal on allowing deductions for home mortgages, for charitable deductions, for most of the other state and local federal taxes paid. Is that right, federal from the state? Yeah. So, you could take those out as well. They're very significant, and they're kind of strike at the marrow of our present tax system. So we and talk about Minnesota being a quote-unquote outlier, which is the charge made if we raise any tax. I would certainly apply to those if we were to eliminate those tax exemptions. So we didn't consider it seriously.
Over the years, Governor Ventura proposed expanding the sales tax base and lowering the rates. Many individual legislators have tossed out that idea. It's always been shot down in the past. Why do you think the time is right for it now?
I don't know. As I said in my remarks, I'm very well aware of the fate of these proposals in the past and how difficult it's going to be, because again, you'll hear this outcry, and it'll have an effect that this is going to take us to ruination. I remember back in the mid-'80s, Governor Perpich proposed broadening the base and made a strategic mistake of extending the sales tax to newsprint, and every editorial board in the state came out strongly against it, and he said, I'm not going to try that again. So, but again, I don't expect this to be popular, because we're trying to make up $1 billion deficit. I expect it to be, I think if people know what it is, they'll be more popular, or you could say less unpopular, than the present system. And that's what we heard over and over. It's like, if you don't do this, then we're back to where we are now. And I think most Minnesotans would say that's worse. And if you look at these figures, this is a better outcome for most Minnesotans in reducing taxes and giving a $500 property tax rebate, which is the most onerous tax. And again, if somebody has a more sophisticated way to do that, then we're certainly willing to consider that. That's what the legislative session is about. But to tell people that they're going to get $500 back from the state of Minnesota because we think their property taxes are too high, I think is a very powerful statement. And then we're going to reduce spending overall. We're going to provide another $80 million for local government aids and another $40 million for county program aids so that they can also keep their property taxes down. We're going to put more state money into our schools, so we're not going to force as many referenda. So we're really going after reducing property taxes while at the same time balancing a budget, while at the same time increasing expenditures in areas that I think are vital to the future of Minnesota. I think it's a balanced approach. I think it's one Minnesotans will see the benefits of, despite all the people who are going to come screaming now about how terrible it's going to be.
Cigarettes, and is there a snowbird tax in there?
There is a snowbird tax, absolutely. It's one of the unfairnesses that somebody can spend 6 months and 1 day out of the state, pay no personal income taxes, and come back here and take advantage of all the state has to offer for 5 months and 29 days. So yes, there's a snowbird tax. Yeah, the cigarette tax is one that I have not been favorable toward in the past. I must say I had to be talked into this time. But the real purpose of this tax is not to raise revenues. It's to get people to quit smoking, and even more so to act as a deterrent to prevent people from starting to smoke. And so I was persuaded that those merits outweighed the regressivity in the cigarette tax. 94 cents more. It puts us at the same level as Wisconsin. Per pack.
How much does this proposal rely on what happens in Washington?
Well, I don't think this proposal itself relies on what happens in Washington in terms of state expenditures, but 31% of our state revenues in the next biennium will come from the federal government from various programs. So once and if those programs start to be cut, and especially if they're going to be cut seriously, then we'll feel those effects. We rank 49th per capita in federal expenditures for our state. So we're about the least reliant state on federal programs of any state in the nation. So if they start cutting them, we'll be comparatively less affected. But we will be affected, and we'll have to deal with that as it comes. I'm not holding my breath to see Congress tackle responsibly the fiscal challenges that they face. You look at all the special interest tax breaks that were incorporated into the last resolution of the fiscal cliff, and you just say, well, when will they ever learn?
What is the ratio between net new taxes gained versus spending cut? Is it 2 to 1? Are you counting that inflation, or is it 10 to 1?
It's very hard to. I'm not avoiding the question, but it's very hard to make a valid comparison because of all these previous gimmicks and shifts. If you look at if you have the line item for the budget, you'll see there's on paper a $966 million increase in debt services for the next biennium versus this one, a 233% increase. Well, which again swells the spending side for the next biennium and caps it for the current biennium. Well, that's just obviously absurd, and it is absurd. It doesn't bear reality. Commissioner Showalter and his staff could explain it in ways that I'm still struggling to understand, but it has to do with the shift, the tobacco bond sales and using some of those revenues to pay for debt instead. So, it's hard to make a calculation. I guess the one I go back to, because I think it's the most valid, is the November 2010 forecast, which was the operative forecast when I took office in January of 2011, predicted a level of spending, and based on current law, based on the laws that the previous governors and legislatures had enacted, that the then 2011 legislature and I inherited, and that predicted another level of spending proposed for this. My level of spending proposed for the next biennium comes in at $1.8 billion less than that forecast, which means that we've cut spending dramatically. Now, spending has increased. We have an older population. We have more people with needs. I want to spend more for education. I think that's a wise investment in the future. It's like the family where, husband and wife sit down. They got 3 teenage kids, and they say, well, we're going to have major expenses in the next few years, put them through college and other things. So we're going to cut back on our family spending. So they forego vacations, they don't get a new car, they, et cetera, et cetera. And lo and behold, 5 years later, those 3 children are now in college. They're paying for part of that. Their mother, one of the mothers, has become infirmed, and she's moved in, and so they're paying for those costs. They didn't buy a new car. The old car needs repairs. If you look at their spending level, those 5 years compared to 5 years before, they're spending more money. So you say, well, they didn't cut spending. Well, they did. But other needs imposed themselves that resulted overall in a higher spending level compared to the previous one, but also a much lower spending level than would have been the case if they hadn't taken those cost-conserving steps. And that's what we've done. Commissioner Jessen and the Department of Human Services has done a phenomenal job of reducing and saving Minnesota taxpayers and federal taxpayers close to over $1 billion and close to $2 billion in 4 years. I don't have those exactly right, but they're on the chart. But you did a phenomenal job of reducing expenditures, yet at the same time, our elderly population grows, our people with disabilities, and those two populations, people with disabilities and the elderly, who make up 25% of the recipients of medical assistance, use 2/3 of the expenditures from those programs. So, and they're going to continue to increase. So, we face the same challenge every other state and the federal government is how to contain health care costs in a way that allows us to have a balanced budgets.
Will there be an increase in the number of state employees under this budget?
If anything, there will be fewer state employees because the inflation is not factored into this biennial budget as it was not to the last one, and the number of state employees was reduced and will continue to probably have to be reduced. Not as much this biennium, if this budget is adopted, as the last biennium. Yeah, I don't.
We have numbers in the detail system. I don't have that figure. I'm not sure there's going to be a net reduction, all said, but the governor's absolutely right about the federal employees. That's going to be one of the key areas that we're going to be watching, and in the end, that is going to fluctuate, I think, a lot as we go forward.
Should you look at increase then?
Sure. We will get you that. They're basically on the budget pages, and I should have said, there's detailed budget pages for all of the governor's initiatives and all of the recommendations that will be out on the web, detailing all of the changes and the impacts therein. We'll get you that summary information.
But also look at, again, from the Minnesota Taxpayers Association, look at the number of state and local employees per capita, and Minnesota ranks about 33rd, and highest among the states. We're not high in public employees. We're not high in expenditures. We now rank 25th, again, according to the Minnesota Taxpayers Association, comparing all the states. Minnesota ranks 25th in total state and local expenditures per $1,000 of personal income.
Governor, what do you say to the person who says, I voted for you because you said you were going to raise income taxes on top earners, not for raising, potentially expanding the sales tax to clothing, for digital goods, for business-to-business services, all these things. This is not why I voted.
Well, I'm saying I'm lowering your taxes. If you're not part of that top 2%, if you could take the total of what we would propose to do, no raise in income taxes for people making, for the 98% of Minnesotans, a wash in terms of sales tax from the Department of Revenue's computations, and a $500 property tax rebate. That's a tax reduction overall. So you can point to one piece of it, as Commissioner Francis said, this is a package. Point to one piece of it and say, well, that's going to go up, but other parts are going to go down even more. So I believe this is true to my promise, lower taxes. It's certainly true to my promise to make taxes fairer. It proposes, again, to raise taxes on the wealthiest 2%. And it still makes the investments that Minnesota needs to make for a successful future, especially in education and in job creation. And I think the last election was about, do you want an extreme budget of just cuts and more cuts? And again, those who don't want to raise any of these taxes, I say, where are you going to cut? You want to eliminate a $1.1 billion deficit with no revenues at all? Then where are you going to cut that $1.1 billion, and who's going to be affected, and how much are they going to be hurt? And enough of these games have suffered through the last 2 years where people who were responsible for making decisions said, well, we'll just give the Commissioner of Management and Budget the responsibility to figure out where to make those cuts. No. They want to make proposed cuts, then fine. But tell us where, tell us who's going to be affected, and tell us by how much. And secondly, I just would point out, the greatness of this state is not in the fact that it's the lowest tax rate, although thanks to Governor Plenty and those legislators, Minnesota dropped to 15th. And again, total state and local taxes per $1,000 of income, according to Minnesota Taxpayer Association again, we're 11th highest in per capita income, so to be 11th highest in income and 15th highest in taxes is definitely within the balance. But, for 30 years this has been repeated. Taxes are too high in Minnesota, they're killing the state, they're killing our economy, they're driving people out. And yet the figures for 2012 show we were the 12th best state in job creation. And we were about a third higher in that percent than the nation as a whole. And we'll get into it. So again, as I said, Minnesota has the 12th best job growth among the 50th states and the District of Columbia in 2012. So the lowest tax states in the country, if this argument holds, lower taxes, better economic growth. South Dakota was the lowest in total state and local taxes per thousand income. In other words, ranked 51st. And it ranked 44th best in job growth. Tennessee was 50th in taxes, but 23rd best in job growth. Alabama was 49th in taxes, 38th in job growth. Missouri, 48th in taxes, 21st in job growth. Idaho, the only one that beat Minnesota of the low-tax states, 47th in taxes, 7th in job growth. New Hampshire, 46th in taxes, and also 46th in job growth. Who is the number one job-creating state in the country? North Dakota, which also had the 4th highest combined state and local tax rate of any of the states. So, yes, we're tax sensitive. Nobody wants to raise taxes. Everybody would like to lower taxes and do the things that make Minnesota a great state, that have made us successful in the past. We may not have the lowest taxes, but we have the best value for taxes for individuals, for businesses, the quality of life, the quality of medical services and environmental protection and clean air and clean water. And yeah, we face all those challenges, but I've been all over this country and I've been around a lot of the world, and no one compares to Minnesota. My physician in Rochester's wife, they lived in Missouri for a couple of years. He said Missouri, their children started in the public schools there, and their attitude is, if you learned enough to pass first grade, that's it. You're not going to give you any advanced studies, any new opportunities. You pass the tests at the beginning of the year, do whatever, because you're on to second grade the next year. And she said it was just phenomenal to come to Minnesota, where there's a whole different approach to providing the best possible education individualized for each and every student. Those are the things that we don't have a perspective on, because most of us, I have never lived in Missouri, but people who have been elsewhere come here appreciate just how much we've done with what we have. And it didn't happen by accident. It didn't happen because we made this state 20, 30 years ago 50th in taxes. Because we had a balanced, responsible approach, good fiscal management, and we invested in education, we invested in job creation, we invested in a better society, and it's paid off, and it will in the future if we continue to do it.
How about the property tax rebate? Everyone is eligible for this. Some very wealthy people could end up getting money, correct?
Yes, but having capped it increases the progressivity, because everybody gets, if you pay $5,000 in property tax, you get a $500 rebate, that's 10%. If you pay $1,000 in property taxes, you get a $500 rebate, that's 50%. So the dollars, yes, would be the same, but on a percent basis, which is how you measure progressivity, regressivity in taxes, it makes it more progressive.
How much of the $2 billion in estimated additional sales tax revenue from this broadening derives from business-to-business services, according to your estimates? Can you say? So
you say the additional sales tax revenue, you're saying apart from broadening the base, not leaving out the rate reduction?
Yeah.
Because it's not a $2 billion net increase overall. It's essentially zero. Broaden the base. I mean, if it's $2 billion, I don't know what it is. Let's say it's $2 billion. And then you lower the rate, you reduce $2 billion, so you end up with a net zero. How much of that comes from, how much of that, so which part do you want to talk about? You want to talk about just the increase part, not the decrease? I don't know which part. distributes to business. Do you?
I think the governor really points out the fact that when you do the rate reduction, everything you've been buying now is now a statewide 5.5%. So it goes down for everybody, for everything that's subject to the sales tax. That has a tremendously progressive effect for the sales tax. And then for those business-to-business services, those will generate more revenue. But the total revenue package is based upon all consumer purchases of all services and all goods. So the net, in terms of the $2 billion to the bottom line, comes from all of the sales.
And may I just go back into that Mall of America concern and other retailers? You know, our rate right now on those items that are taxed, we're the 7th highest state in the nation in our sales tax rate. This combination of broadening the base, reducing the rate to 5.5% brings us down to 27th. In other words, right in the middle among the states in our sales tax rate. Yes, this is applied to more items, but and I don't know the particulars of South Dakota, North Dakota, or Wisconsin, Iowa, but overall, it's we're competitive with other states. And what really hurts our retailers more than anything is, as the Commissioner said, no taxes on the Internet purchases, and we're going to do our best this time. We proposed last year correcting that as best we can for the Minnesota part of things. And if the federal government would ever get going, they do it for the federal, we'd have a significant revenue increase. Was it about $500 million? $400 million a year, Biden. Yes. $400 million a year additional revenues, and every other state would benefit the same. And that's again where the federal system, state system are unfair, they're inequitable. Inequitable means somebody who can afford to pay more pays less, and somebody who can only afford to pay less pays more. But the entrenched interests who benefit from that and everybody else, too bad, are going to oppose these changes that are just common sense changes that are going to benefit the vast majority of people in this country. And people understand that when that doesn't happen, there's some disconnect between government and the citizens it's supposed to serve. It's worse in Washington. It's not going to happen in Minnesota.
Are there any exempted consumer services or business services?
Medical services, burial services.
Burial services?
Correct.
Speaking of your position,
you only get to take that exemption once. So.
Speaking of medical, how are you feeling?
I'm sorry?
How are you feeling?
Well, so let's finish up on related, and then I'll be glad to respond to questions.
The school shift repayment, the decision to stretch that out over the next 4 years instead of
we repaid $1.6 billion in this biennium, $300 million, and then with this last forecast, the surplus there, the 1.3, we paid 1.6, so we have 1.1 billion left. So we made major strides forward, and yes, there's more to do. If my revenue proposal, raising the income tax rate by 2% on the wealthiest 2%, which I made in 2011, if that had been adopted, we would have enough of a surplus in this biennium to pay off the school debt entirely. And we'd have enough revenue to start the next biennium without a projected deficit. And that's the difference between responsible financial management and avoiding those problems and making lots of speeches about what they're not doing and passing the expenses on to the next biennium or even the next generation. So it'll take till the end of the next biennium, but we'll get there and then we won't do it again.
Governor, you had a task force look at the local government aid program. Does this budget include a change in that formula or any other significant revisions to that program other than increasing the funding?
It does not at this point, but we're certainly glad to talk with the legislature about that. And you get some insight?
Yeah, we did include one adjustment on the formula, but a minor. So there is a proposal on the LGA formula that we're working with right now, but that's all.
See, he played 5 sports in high school. I only played 3, so he's obviously smarter than I am.
How many jobs would this proposal create?
Well, more than without it. I don't know. I can't give you a number. I mean, as we point out,
about a few here and there. Are we talking about hundreds?
I think we're talking about many thousands of jobs, and now that better jobs. We was a conference in California a couple weeks ago, and the representative of Microsoft said there are currently 3,600 vacancies in Microsoft system, all for people with computer science degrees or experience. Starting salary is $105,000. With benefits, it's a $200,000 a year package. A lot of my commissioners started filling out applications right away. But they don't have the people. There's other companies in that field are in the same boat. There aren't the people with the experience or the training, and this is why we got to realign our education system for those hugely well-paying jobs. I thought, what if we could go into every high school in Minnesota and say, you know, if you high school sophomore juniors, if you focus on computer science and you do your best here and you go through 4 years of college, you can step out and start earning over $100,000 a year. I would think it would motivate a lot of them. But there's this disconnect between what people think their options are and what they are potentially. And so those are the kind of things that and I've heard that all over the state from businesses. We can't fill engineers. We can't fill architectural draftsmen and women. We can't fill this because we don't have those specialized skills. So the opportunities are there, but they all depend on education. And everybody says the economy of the future is going to be even more reliant on people with good education. So good education translates to better jobs, more jobs, and I think it's clear that we need to get back and on track toward that goal.
Hey, Governor, you say you expect powerful opposition to your budget for a better Minnesota. Would you elaborate on exactly where you expect the powerful opposition to come from, how you expect your DFL allies in the legislature to stand up to that, and are you setting up a situation where business and corporate interests are at odds with your budget for a better Minnesota?
Well, I can't say who's going to be at odds with it and who will support it. If people look at the best interests of the state of Minnesota beyond their own individual concern, and everybody looks at their individual concern, I respect that. But if you take a look at the fact that we're all interdependent and that Minnesota, to be successful in the future, benefits everybody, and conversely unsuccessful harms everybody, then to me, everyone should support it. That's obviously my point of view. Though in the past I have seen in state and federal tax reform initiatives that people who pay nothing or pay less than what they would in the fair system, most of them oppose those changes. Some are definitely far more enlightened and far more have a broader view, and they're supportive. We've seen that in Minnesota with high wealth, high income individuals who come out and said publicly they would support paying more in taxes. I'm not out to raise anybody's taxes. I'm out to raise enough revenues to do what's right for Minnesota. And so, if somebody thinks that it's unnecessary spending somewhere, please tell me where it is. I mean that sincerely. We spent 2 years looking everywhere, scouring every program, looking for how we can reduce, looking at how we can streamline, look how we can make it more efficient, better. And we'll continue to do so. So if anybody's got ideas about how to reduce state spending in ways that don't harm people, we're all ears. Otherwise, at least have the honesty and the integrity to say, well, we don't want to pay $1 more in taxes, and so, make another cut in nursing homes, or don't give nursing home care providers any kind of increase for the 5th and 6th years in a row. I mean, be specific about who's going to take the hit. And that's the debate we'll have. That's the debate the next 5 months we'll have in the legislature. I don't know a quarter of the legislators. Looking forward to meeting them. We're having receptions starting next week. I'll be looking forward to working with them. So I don't know. We're meeting with the 4 caucuses this afternoon. Maybe get a sense of it. So, but again, I would just say to those who are going to oppose this, what's your better alternative?
Education spending, it's a big emphasis here. Is any of it linked to outcomes or expectations that you want to see? Well,
Commissioner Casilius is holding a briefing after this, and I think she could address that better than I. But yes, we're focused on improving the quality of education, early childhood, which leads into all-day kindergarten, which leads into Senator Jen Olson's terrific initiative for this biennium, starting the next one, about being able to read at grade level by the end of 3rd grade. I mean, all that's a continuum, and we're looking at outcomes, absolutely. Same thing with what Commissioner Casilius and Director of Higher Education, Poggemiller, have been working on, which is a continuum between high school and college, and again, linked to the jobs of the future, and also preparing young people for better for the opportunities of the future. And the University and MINSCU are, of course, part of that. And also making access to higher education more affordable, especially for middle-income families who are really being priced out of the market with the tuition increases at both the MINSCU and the university campuses.
Governor, you're providing additional funding for Metro Transit, but nothing for roads and bridges. Why not?
Because Commissioner Zelli's only been on the job for like a week. So I gave him a week's extension. There's an obscure clause in the Minnesota Constitution that allows a one-time 2-month postponement of...
Can you cite that clause?
A question on the sales tax. Is this revenue neutral, or are you actually adding revenue to the bottom line of the state's revenue picture? You've got a figure of $2 billion roughly. You are adding $2 billion in revenue, correct?
Total revenue. In total revenues, not the sales tax, but total revenues.
The sales tax, you flattened it out and you made it lower.
For consumers.
Does that mean it's a revenue neutral number?
For the consumers, the typical consumer will pay no more additional sales tax, but it does...
Budget picture on the bottom line.
Right,
it
is generating revenue for the total budget.
It is generating revenue, and about how much revenue is going to be generating over 2 years?
I had that in front of me. It was in my head earlier. About $2 billion.
But I would point out that we have a $1.1 billion deficit to overcome, which I'm frank to admit I'm proposing to raise revenues rather than cut more services. If someone doesn't want to raise that $1.1 billion in revenues, if they want to raise it differently, they should tell us how. If they don't want to raise it at all from revenues, then they need to tell us where to cut $1.1 billion, and that just gets us to the starting point. So, I mean, this is about trade-offs. This is about values and priorities and choices that are made based on them. And these are mine. And others will have others, and that's the way it's supposed to be in a democracy. I look forward to the next 5 months. There'll be lots of disagreements, people in both parties, and as Tom Daschle said, that's the noise of democracy. And I know you'll pick up on every piece of it, and that's fine. But, the result is it comes out of the end of the process, and I hope that and believe that result can be a better Minnesota, fairer tax system leading to that, and investments that are going to create jobs and economic growth. Is that?
One last budget question, John.
Governor, Republicans are ready to criticize you for raising taxes on the middle class. Unless you buy clothes worth more than $100, are you, as a middle-class citizen, going to pay more taxes?
Well, they misinformed Minnesotans, and I'm feeling nice today. They misinformed Minnesotans about the facts of my tax proposal for the last 2 years. When very clearly I was only proposing to raise taxes of any kind on the wealthiest 2% of Minnesotans. They said I was going to raise everybody's taxes, income taxes. Not true. They denied any responsibility for the drastic property tax increases caused by their cuts in local government aids and their elimination of homestead credit. And last November showed that most people in Minnesota believed and trusted what I was saying rather than them. And I also happen to know I had the truth on my side. In this case, go back again, and Commissioner France would be happy to go through these examples, and if people want to run other scenarios, we'll ask revenue to cut other scenarios. But if you're a middle-income family or even upper middle income, and your combined income with your spouse is less than $250,000 a year in taxable income, and you're paying $500 or more in property taxes, you will get a $500 reduction in your total state and local taxes. And sales tax will be a wash. You'll pay on more items, you'll pay a lower rate. If somebody, those are the facts. Individual making taxable income less than $150,000, same deal, and paying over $500 in property taxes. $500 cut, tax cut. So I don't know where you could fabricate this, raising taxes on the average Minnesota, but they've done it before, so I would expect they'll do it again.
How would it be a wash with raising $2 billion more?
For consumers, well, because consumers, businesses that haven't been, businesses more than anybody have said broaden the base. Now some of them say, well, broaden the base, but only on consumers and leave us alone. I don't think that's fair. I mean, that's the common refrain when you get to tax reform. Russell Long, chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, used to say, don't tax me, don't tax thee, tax the guy behind the tree. And I mean, that's the perpetual battle that goes on every time anybody proposes this at any level. So we'll have it again this time. But again, Minnesotans, the vast majority of Minnesotans know the present system is unfair. It's unfair to middle-income families, it's unfair to working families, and this, I believe it has to change.
But if businesses pay higher taxes, don't the rest of us end up paying?
Well, that's the argument against any tax on business. I mean, that's argument against any of the existing sales tax, is argument against the corporate tax. I'll let the economists, my own view is you tax entities and people fairly. You come out with a system that people trust and they believe is working as best it can for them. I mean, this is the beginning. We have, over the next decade or so, especially at the federal level, dug ourselves into a hole that is going to require a lot of these tough decisions. And I hope that, I understand and I respect that people want to look at their own individual situation. They should. They certainly have a right to. But you got to also look at the broader picture. What's going to preserve and enhance this state? What's going to preserve this country fiscally? Because right now, it's going to ruination at the federal level. So nobody wants to pay $1 more in taxes. Everybody wants to continue to get their special tax breaks. Our deficit will continue to exceed $1 trillion a year. And our kids and our grandkids are going to look at us in a decade or two and say, what did you do to us? That's what's at stake. Be easier just to propose continuation of the status quo, try to pick up the deficit somehow, and avoid all this. But that would be irresponsible in my view, because the future really is at stake.